and 3. Up next on the presidency, historian Daniel Feller revisits President Andrew Jackson's bank war of the 1830s, a political struggle to challenge and even cripple the powerful Bank of the United States, the young country's only national financial institution. Mr. Feller teaches at the University of Tennessee and directs the Papers of Andrew Jackson project. The White House Historical Association hosted this hour-long event.
Welcome to everybody. We're delighted to have you here. I'm Dr. Curtis Sandberg. I'm the director of the David M. Rubenstein National Center for White House History, and I have this long title. I'm concurrently the association's senior vice president for educational resources, and I would like, sort of contextually, to put this all into a nice picture. Share background about the association, and then that places tonight's talk into a proper context. We are, and some of you may know already, but we're a private, nonprofit educational organization, and the mission of the place, and it has been for a long, long time, is to enhance the understanding and the appreciation of the executive mansion. And a long, long time means 56 years at this point. It's 1961. This is during the Kennedy administration, and First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy founded the association, and its purpose was to help the White House to collect and exhibit the very best of American history and culture, but underscoring all of that, to inform and excite the public about the history of the executive mansion. So today, fast forwarding all these years, we're still doing this. Acquisition, preservation, research, education efforts, they continue through the sale of our books, our products. I'll tell you more about that in a sec. The official White House ornament, which some of you may know as well. And then also in recent years from private and corporate donations. Now, to strengthen our goal, the overarching goal, which is to widely share White House history with the public. Last year, we created this lecture series, and its purpose is to bring, pointing at Dr. Feller over here, well-known authors and historians to the association to share their knowledge and their insight with the public, and to humanize the White House, its inhabitants, things that happen there, and we all have a good takeaway. Now, we're delighted to have Professor Feller with us tonight, and he's going to speak about, as you know, Andrew Jackson and the White House, but also the origins and the events and the enduring legacy of Jackson's bank war, and then taking that a step further, the impact of that on the role of the president in later generations. And it does bear noting, because we do anniversaries, I was thinking through this lecture series, that 2017, this year is also, it's a benchmark, because Jackson was born in 1767. So that makes it 250 years. So that box is being checked as well. Now, before turning the podium over to Dr. Feller, it's important to share a few salient elements about his really impressive and far-reaching background. He's a professor at the University of Tennessee, and he will tell you more about this momentarily. He's also the editor of the Papers of Andrew Jackson. And on the sort of curriculum part, he, prior to joining the Tennessee faculty, he was at a pretty neat place. He was at the University of New Mexico, Albuquerque. And then before that, at Northland College, which is in Ashland, Wisconsin. And his connection with the Papers of Andrew Jackson goes all the way back in time to that period. He has contributed to numerous historical publications, and there's some good ones. We went over this together. The New Oxford University Press volume, which has a very cool title called When Life Strikes the President. His critical essays and review articles have appeared in many, many scholarly publications, and he's been on television shows. He's been on many television shows, including History Detectives, Who Do You Think You Are?, and CNN's Race for the White House. And among his many pursuits, he continues to carry out scholarly research that contributes in terms of all of us to our understanding and appreciation of America's history. Now, in closing, a little tiny moment of bookkeeping. I think some of you may have gotten these on the way in, but we are offering tonight, the association, a 10% discount on everything over there in the store. It's going to be open until 6, so it encompasses the totality of the evening and the event. And there is this very wonderful Andrew Jackson ornament, and it comes in a box set, so there are a couple of others that come with it. So that's a thought as well among our many, many White House Christmas ornaments. So on that note, please, all of you, join me in very warmly welcoming Professor Daniel Feller.
Thank you, Curtis, and thank you all for being here. For me, this is a very timely visit. As Curtis said, I'm the editor of the Papers of Andrew Jackson, and at that project we are publishing all of Andrew Jackson's papers, at least all the surviving ones, in chronological order. And our last volume covered the year 1832, and I'm going to draw on that in what I tell you in a few minutes. In 1833, which is the year we're working on now, as it happened just last week, I was sitting at my desk editing and preparing for publication the letters that Susan Decatur, living in the Decatur house, wrote to Andrew Jackson in May 1833 saying, well, we just auctioned off all my furniture and I'm still broke. Would you buy for me out of charity all of my tableware and silver and plate, which Jackson did, and then went down to the Hermitage, and I'm not sure where the stuff is now. Anyway, my subject today is President Andrew Jackson's bank war, but I'm going to begin by asking a favor. You have perhaps heard or read something about Jackson of late. He's been very much in the news. And that something may have left an impression in your mind about his character and his presidency. Please put it aside because it may very well be wrong. We seem to be engaged today in a kind of public war on many fronts between loud fictions and quiet facts. And at least in Jackson's case, the fictions seem to be winning. They come from all sides, everyone from the President of the United States and his acolytes at one side to his severest critics on the other, have joined in propounding an image of Jackson as a kind of bumptious cowboy in the White House, an image that lies somewhere between tendentiously misleading and just plain false. As example, President Trump at the Hermitage, laying a wreath on Jackson's birthday for the 250th anniversary, said that tough guy Jackson laid tariffs on foreign imports. The truth of that is exactly the reverse. The National Review called a highly nationalistic, even menacing presidential address on foreign relations a few weeks ago, in its words, a very Jacksonian speech. There was nothing whatsoever Jacksonian about it. On the other side of the political fence, an Atlantic magazine cover story declared that Jackson fought at least 14 duels. Newsweek magazine, not to be outdone, upped that number to 100 duels. You know how many duels Andrew Jackson actually fought? One. Count them, one. The New York Times declared a little while back that Jackson, and this is its word, annihilated the southeastern Indians. Not expelled, not deported, not evicted, but annihilated, which, last I looked at a dictionary, meant he killed them all. And to top it all off, just days ago, a Washington Post senior national security correspondent named Karen DeYoung, in an article about presidential insults or political insults, reported that Jackson said to his vice president, "John C. Calhoun, if you secede from my nation, I will secede your head from your body," which is charming and completely false, fake. Even John Meacham's recent Time magazine special issue on Jackson, which is otherwise very good, by the way, concludes with a page of bold quotations, several of which are dubious or just plain made up. And one of the made up ones, in fact, is the very first one on the page. "Take time to deliberate, but when the time for action arrives, stop thinking and go in." We are, in short, regrettably bombarded from all sides by fake history on Andrew Jackson, much of it going to suggest that Jackson as president was impulsive and uncontrollably violent. Now, I'm not here to defend Jackson, but I am going to tell you a story which I think challenges that perception, one that is closely grounded in contemporary sources, the ones that I work with, especially in Jackson's own surviving papers. In other words, a story that is, to the best of my knowledge, actually true. On July 5th, 1832, Martin Van Buren, who had been Jackson's Secretary of State and now was his running mate in the 1832 presidential election, arrived at the White House at midnight. He had just the day before that landed in New York City after almost a year abroad, and he had rushed down to Washington in one day at Jackson's urgent summons. He found the president sprawled out on a sickbed, and Jackson took his hand and said, and these are Van Buren's words describing it, with the clearest indications of a mind composed and in a tone entirely devoid of passion or bluster, he said, "The bank, Mr. Van Buren, is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." Well, Van Buren first told this story many years later in his autobiography, and he explained that he had kept it secret up until then for the fear that, in his words, casual hearers would misinterpret it to mean that Jackson had acted against the bank from, again, Van Buren's words, offended personal feelings, which Van Buren said was without the slightest foundation in truth. Well, Van Buren was right to worry, because from his day to our own, Andrew Jackson's destruction of the Bank of the United States has been denounced by critics as reckless and vindictive, an act of private, peevish spleen for which the nation was made to pay dearly. Calling for Andrew Jackson's eviction from the $20 bill in 2015, by the way, I have no opinion on that. No opinion on it. They want to change the faces, that's fine with me. But calling for Jackson's eviction, the New York Times charged him with wantonly and outrageously destroying the bank, which was, after all, as the Times pronounced, a predecessor of the Federal Reserve. Now, I'm not going to try to convince you that killing the bank was wise. I'm not sure that it was. I am going to try to persuade you that it was by no means hasty or impulsive, and that the concerns that motivated it were far from merely personal. At the heart of Jackson's so-called bank war were issues that were serious and weighty then, perhaps serious and weighty still today. So let me begin by setting the stage. In 1816, Congress had chartered or incorporated the Second Bank of the United States for 20 years, till 1836. Remember that year. The bank was headquartered in Philadelphia with power to establish branches wherever it wanted to. By 1832, 4 years before that charter was going to run out, the bank had 25 branches in 20 different states and the District of Columbia. The bank's capital stock was set at $35 million at a time when the annual entire federal budget was about $20 million. The bank was neither simply a private concern, nor was it an arm of government, but it was a hybrid of both. The United States owned 1/5 of its capital stock, $7 million, and the President of the United States, with Senate consent, appointed 5 of the bank's 25 members of the board of directors. The bank was to be the federal government's own banker. It performed some of the functions of today's Federal Reserve and also some of the functions of today's Treasury Department. It brokered federal loans. It received, stored, transported, and paid out government funds. And it issued banknotes, which were the country's only legal tender paper currency. But the bank was also, with all of this, a commercial business. It loaned money in competition with other banks, it made profits, and it paid dividends. Clothed by its charter with, and these words are in the charter, exclusive privileges and benefits. Operating throughout the land, when every other bank in the country was confined to a single state and most of them to a single city, at a time when the Treasury Department itself consisted of a few dozen Washington clerks and a scattering of land offices and customs offices throughout the country, the Bank of the United States was literally the only national financial institution in the country. It held immense power over the functions of government, the solvency of other banks, the stability of the nation's economic system, and the welfare of the citizens. Well, this mix of private and public in the bank's organization had been a deliberate feature of Alexander Hamilton's design for the Second Bank of the United States' predecessor, the First Bank of the United States, which had also been chartered for 20 years from 1791, and then it was allowed to expire in 1811. And Hamilton deliberately mixed public and private interest in the bank because he thought it was necessary to fortify confidence in the soundness of the new government's finances. But by the time Andrew Jackson took the inaugural oath in 1829, the ability of the United States and the willingness of the United States to pay its bills, which is what Hamilton had been concerned about, was no longer in question. And the bank's hybrid private-public nature stood out, as we shall see, for other reasons. Now, the origins of Andrew Jackson's hostility to the bank are obscure. They are sometimes attributed, to my mind, very unpersuasively, to an early financial disaster of his own where he had been burned by endorsing another man's bad notes. Jackson purportedly said during his presidency that he had always opposed all banks. But as we have learned at the Jackson Papers, Jackson had a notoriously pliant memory and a pronounced habit of believing that he had always believed whatever he happened to believe at the current moment. There were, at any rate, plenty of good reasons to distrust banks. Banking was not, in the early republic, as we hope it is today, a staid and upright profession operating on well-known principles and accepted standards. It was at best a half-understood, half-mysterious trade, and at worst, banking was something close to a con game. Bank charters were produced from state legislatures throughout the country through political influence. Often the people seeking those charters were not men with money to lend, but impecunious and ambitious men who wanted to create banks so that they could borrow from them. The hard capital with which banks supposedly started was often fictitious. It consisted of IOUs that were paid into the bank with the idea that you'd be able to redeem the IOUs from the profits that the bank would make after you set it up. Self-dealing among bank officers was routine, corruption was not uncommon, and failures were frequent. Even the Second Bank of the United States itself, chartered back in 1816, had begun its career with a spree of speculation, embezzlement, and fraud that by 1820 had brought it to the edge of insolvency and required a wholesale purge of its management. Given what we know of, say, Thomas Jefferson's politics, it would be no surprise to learn that he condemned all chartered banking as, and this is a quotation, a sacrifice of public and private interest to a few aristocratical friends and favorites. Except that Jefferson didn't say that. The man who said that was Jefferson's Federalist opponent and later friend, Federalist John Adams of Massachusetts. The Bank of the United States kept a low and competent profile through the 1820s under the deft management of its president, a man named Nicholas Biddle. It was not an issue in the storied 1828 presidential campaign when Jackson defeated the son of old John Adams, John Quincy Adams. And Jackson said nothing about it in his inaugural address on March 4th, 1829. The first inklings of trouble came afterwards when reports reached Jackson that certain branches of the bank had tried to wield their influence against him in the 1828 election. Again, he heard about this afterwards. Now, given Jackson's sense of grievance over that election, an election in which Jackson believed, and these are all his words, the virtuous yeomanry of the United States had sustained him against, more Jackson's words, all the torrents of slander that corruption and wickedness could invent, circulated through subsidized presses in every way supported by the patronage of the government. Given that sense of grievance, if you look at the election that way, learning that the Bank of the United States was part of that torrent of wickedness and abuse would be enough by itself to set you off against it. Already by 1829, June of 1829, when he'd been president all of 3 months, Jackson was writing friends that the only thing that can prevent our liberties to be crushed by the bank and its influence would be to kill the bank itself. Well, Jackson challenged both the constitutionality and the efficacy, the financial efficacy, the competence, you might say, of the Bank of the United States in his first annual message to Congress in December 1829. This attack came out of the blue. It startled his audience when against the advice of several members of his cabinet. But Jackson got backing from his confidential inner circle, including a Treasury auditor and presidential wordsmith named Amos Kendall. And the district attorney, whom Jackson had appointed district attorney for the Southern District of New York, a man named James A. Hamilton, who was Martin Van Buren's political sidekick and also, as it happened, a son of the former Secretary Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton. Well, the language of Jackson's official criticism of the bank in his first annual message was somewhat restrained, but his private words were not. He wrote Hamilton that he was being opposed by, these are Jackson's words, all the sordid and interested who prize self-interest more than the perpetuity of our liberty and the blessings of a free Republican government. He was opposed again by this moneyed aristocracy with its corrupting influence preparing for a renewal of its charter, which I view as the death blow to our liberty. Well, Jackson asked Hamilton for a plan for a government-owned institution to take over the official functions of the bank if he should kill the bank itself. Hamilton gave him one, a plan for a government substitute, early in 1830, beginning with a bill of particulars against the existing Bank of the United States. And that bill of particulars was under two headings. One, it's unconstitutional. Two, it's dangerous to liberty. And the text under dangerous to liberty began with this: because in the number, wealth, and standing of its officers and stockholders, in its power to make loans or withhold them, to call oppressively upon its debtors or to indulge them, to build houses, to rent lands, to make donations for political or other purposes, the bank embodies a fearful influence which may be wielded for the aggrandizement of a favorite individual, a particular interest, or a separate party. Two, because it concentrates in the hands of a few men a power over the money of the country, which may be perverted, to the oppression of the people, and in times of public calamity, to the embarrassments of the government. This is what Alexander Hamilton's son thought of the Bank of the United States. Well, Jackson kept a private memorandum book in which he jotted down occasional notes to himself, usually a few lines or less, really short things. Into this private memo book, he copied Hamilton's entire memorandum on the bank, 6.5 pages long. Parts of it are traceable in Jackson's own veto of the Bank of the United States 2.5 years later. Well, in January 1832, 4 years before its charter was due to expire, you remember in 1836, the bank formally applied to Congress for a renewal. Now, this timing was not accidental. A presidential election was coming up in the fall. Jackson had declared against the bank now in 3 annual messages. His opponent for the presidency in 1832, Henry Clay, was an advocate for the bank. And Clay and Biddle, president of the bank, who were in communication with each other, calculated that the bank was so obviously indispensable to the country that Jackson would not dare to veto a recharter. And if he did, they'd make an issue out of it in the campaign. Well, some of Jackson's counselors, even within his own cabinet, favored rechartering the bank, and that has fooled historians, some of them, into thinking that there was possibly some compromise that could have been worked out. But the evidence of Jackson's papers proves otherwise. To paraphrase Charlton Heston, who you may remember made a career out of playing Andrew Jackson in a whole string of movies, the only way Jackson was going to sign a recharter bill was with a pen inserted into his cold, dead fingers. Well, in fact, Jackson, drawing on ideas that had been gathering for more than 2 years, had started assembling materials for a veto the minute the recharter bill landed on the floor of Congress. In June of 1832, he gave them all to this guy, Amos Kendall, who was Jackson's best wordsmith. And Kendall, after a few weeks, gave back to Jackson a closely written draft for a veto, 59 pages long, just as the recharter bill finally passed Congress and was presented to Jackson with deliberate timing on July 4th, 1832. Well, Roger Taney, and yeah, this is the same guy who Jackson later appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and is now forever branded as the man who delivered the Dred Scott decision. At this time, he was Jackson's Attorney General, and he has left us a picture of what came next. Jackson wanted someone to work over Kendall's draft. And Taney, who had been urging Jackson to veto all along, Taney was a one member of Jackson's cabinet who was in favor of vetoing the recharter. Taney was the only one that Jackson thought he could trust. For company, Jackson had living with him in the White House a professional artist, a guy named Ralph E.W. Earl, who had painted landscapes and historical scenes and any number of portraits of Jackson himself. If you've seen a portrait of Jackson, it's almost certainly an Earl portrait. Did them over and over and over again. So Earl had converted one room in the White House, unfortunately I don't know which, converted one room into the White House, into a studio. And that is where Taney and the president's nephew and private secretary, Andrew Jackson Donaldson, set themselves up to work. They spent, according to Taney, 3 days going over Kendall's draft. Jackson himself would occasionally wander in, approve a passage, make some suggestions, and then go back out. Over the entire time, Earl was painting away, paying them absolutely no attention whatsoever. Completely oblivious. Now, as we know from this draft, because the draft survives, and we printed it in the last volume of the Papers of Andrew Jackson, and as we know from that draft, most of Taney's revision consisted of simply crossing things out. If you take Kendall's original 59-page draft and leave out all the crossouts, what's left is the bank veto almost word for word in final form. By the way, we printed it with all the crossouts there. So you can see what was crossed out. In particular, Kendall wandered off into a whole bunch of rants against the British moneyed aristocracy, and they took all of those out. Well, in final form, as Jackson delivered it to Congress on July 10th, 1832, the bank veto is a hodgepodge, frankly, of arguments. Some constitutional arguments, some financial arguments, some historical arguments, some nationalistic arguments, nationalistic and even xenophobic, some arguments that are rather weighty and some of them that are rather silly. But its most arresting and enduring passage was this. This is from the bank veto, July 10th, 1832. It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the axe of government to their selfish purposes. In the full enjoyment of the gifts of heaven and the fruits of superior industry, economy, and virtue, every man is equally entitled to protection by law. But when the laws undertake to add to those natural and just advantages, artificial distinctions, to grant titles, gratuities, and exclusive privileges. Remember that language is in the bank charter, exclusive privileges. To make the rich richer when the laws undertake, to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful. Then the humble members of society, the farmers, mechanics, and laborers, who have neither the time nor the means of securing like favors to themselves, have a right to complain of the injustice of their government. No president before had said anything like this. Other presidents had warned Americans against entangling foreign alliances. They had warned Americans against sectionalism and excessive partisanship at home. Jackson warned them against control of their own government by, in his words, the rich and powerful. The language was unprecedented and, in some eyes, unpresidential. Martin Van Buren called the veto message, in his words, the most effective document amongst the people that was ever issued under like circumstances. Nicholas Biddle, president of the Bank of the United States, called it a manifesto of anarchy such as Marat or Robespierre might have issued to the mob. Well, the veto didn't end the war. Rather, it just escalated it. The bank still had 4 years to live under its original 1816 charter. It was still rich, still powerful, and still bent on recharter. If it had, in fact, stayed out of politics down to this point, which Nicholas Biddle rather dubiously claimed, it dropped that forbearance after the veto with a vengeance. In the 1832 presidential contest, the bank campaigned openly for Henry Clay and against Jackson, spent thousands of dollars on loans to newspaper editors and congressmen, and on publications opposing the bank veto, including one scurrilous piece which Biddle wrote himself, in which he called Jackson a miserable dotard. Love that word. These expenses were recorded on the bank's books, which, by the way, were subject to Treasury inspection, recorded on the bank's books under the innocuous heading of printing and stationery. And as Jackson himself noted, since the United States owned 1/5 of the bank's stock, this campaign to sway government policy and to defeat a president was, in fact, being waged with the government's, or rather the people's, own money. Well, Biddle's campaign failed miserably. Jackson was overwhelmingly reelected, and the bank's fate was seemingly sealed. But another episode that played out simultaneously with the presidential campaign helped convince Jackson that he could now not wait patiently for the bank to wrap up and go out of business in 1836, that it needed to be defanged, stripped of its power to do further damage right now. And that affair concerned the so-called 3%. The 3% were outstanding government bonds held largely by British and European investors, representing nearly the last of the federal debt. Early in 1832, Jackson's Treasury Secretary Louis McLean notified Biddle of the government's intent to redeem most of the 3%, with government funds ample to that purpose, which were on deposit with the Bank of the United States. The United States, in fact, had somewhere around $7 or $8 million in its account at that time, just sitting there with the Bank of the United States. They were going to redeem about $6 million worth of 3%. Biddle requested from McLean a 3-month extension from July until October. He then arranged with the bank's corresponding house in Britain, Barings of London, arranged with Barings to buy up the foreign-held debt certificates and hold them for redemption later on, with the bank paying the regular interest in the interval. Now, I realize this is a little complicated. It took me a while to figure out what was going on myself. From a banker's perspective, this spreading out of the redemption, which is what it was smart and even brilliant, because if Biddle didn't do that, the Bank of the United States was going to have to make a massive cash payment all at once, all of it in specie, gold and silver. And to do that, it would have to curtail its business, call in its loans, thus threatening commercial stability at a time when financial markets, for other reasons, including a cholera epidemic, were unusually vulnerable. Everything worked. The bondholders still got paid. They just got paid a few months later. The government suffered no loss. The business of the country went on without a ripple of disruption. Everybody won. That's not how it looked to Andrew Jackson. For this reason, Biddle had handled the whole transaction through the bank's exchange committee, which was a personally hand-picked subcommittee of the full board of directors, on which none of the government directors sat. Remember, the President of the United States appointed 5 of the 25 directors. And the Exchange Committee conducted its operations in strict secrecy. Not only secrecy from the government, but secrecy from the other members of the board of directors. In fact, it was only after the operation was complete that the Treasury even learned that it had gone on. Another thing about the operation was that the way Biddle arranged it, it flatly violated some of the terms in the details of the bank's charter. It became known publicly accidentally, and at that point Biddle publicly repudiated it after it became known what he was doing. Until that point, the government knew nothing whatever about any of this. What it then learned after the fact was that although it had ample funds on deposit in the bank to redeem the last of the debt, and had ordered it redeemed, months later, the bondholders were still unpaid, the government was still liable to them, and the bank still had the money. Well, above all else, it was this apparently brazen violation of law and trust that prompted Jackson and his advisors to question not only the bank's honesty, but even its solvency. And that decided Jackson in 1833 to order the removal of the deposits. That is, to stop using the Bank of the United States as a government depository, draw down the government's balances in the bank, and deposit its money from now on in whatever state-chartered banks could be found that would be willing to take them. Stripped of the government funds in its vaults, the bank's ability to wage war against the government would be drastically curtailed. Well, under the bank's charter, the man who had legal authority to remove the deposits was not the President of the United States, but the Secretary of the Treasury, who for this purpose was a kind of quasi-autonomous agent. Much to Jackson's astonishment, his new Treasury Secretary, a guy named William John Duane, who had been appointed for exactly this purpose, balked at ordering the removal of the deposits. So on September 18th, 1833, Jackson convened his cabinet and read them a paper stating it as his decision upon his responsibility to remove the deposits starting October 1st, which was just 2 weeks away. Duane still didn't get the message, or rather he got it but refused to heed it. He refused to sign the order removing the deposits, and so on September 23rd, a Monday, not a Saturday, Jackson fired him and replaced him with Roger Taney, previously the Attorney General. That was on September 23rd. On September 26th, 3 days after his appointment, Taney signed the order to remove the deposits, starting October 1st. All this is being done while Congress is out of session. In December, a new Congress convened. Jackson men controlled the House of Representatives, but they were in the minority in the Senate, so that's where the action took place. The Senate began by officially demanding to see that paper that Jackson had read to the cabinet back on September 18th. Now, this document was the opposite of secret. It was meant for public view. It was meant to explain Jackson's policy not only to his cabinet, but to everybody else, and it appeared in the newspapers the day after Jackson read it to the cabinet. But invoking what today would be called executive privilege, when the Senate called for it officially, Jackson responded politely that what he told his cabinet was none of your damn business. On March 28, 1834, the Senate voted by 26 to 20, and this is the language of the resolution that it adopted, that the President, in the late executive proceedings in relation to the public revenue, has assumed upon himself authority and power not conferred by the Constitution and laws, but in derogation of both. It was, in other words, an official censure. And this is the first and, so far, last time that the United States Senate has officially censured a president. Well, Jackson replied with an official protest, a very forceful one. He said that the Senate, correctly, had issued what was meant to stand as the moral equivalent of an impeachment verdict, yet it had done so without an actual impeachment vote by the House of Representatives. There were no specific charges, there was no evidence, there was no trial, and there was no two-thirds majority, which it requires to really convict somebody. Remember, the vote was 26 to 20. These proceedings, Jackson said, were quote, palpably repugnant to the Constitution. Furthermore, he said they were anti-democratic because the Senate was a body, and this is also Jackson's language, not elected by the people and not to them directly responsible. While the President of the United States, he didn't say I, was, and I quote again, the direct representative of the American people. Well, the Senate stood its ground. It branded Jackson's protest as a breach of official privilege, refused to enter it on the journal, refused to acknowledge that it had been received, and denied Jackson's right to officially challenge or criticize it in any way. But even this did not stand. Now, in law, of course, the censure meant nothing, but its symbolic importance was immense. Almost immediately after the Senate passed it, a Jacksonian senator from Missouri named Thomas Hart Benton moved a resolution to expunge the censure. That is, literally not rescind it or repeal it, but literally cross it out. He introduced that resolution. It failed in 1834, it failed in 1835, it failed in 1836. But meanwhile, out in the hinterlands, Jackson men, by now calling themselves Democrats, were organizing with the expunging resolution as their rallying point. And in state after state, senators who would not pledge to vote for the expunging resolution were either voted out of office by state legislatures or compelled to resign. By state legislatures, I should add, acting on cue from the White House. The crowning triumph came in January 1837, just 6 weeks before the end of Jackson's presidency. Benton's expunging resolution finally passed. The original handwritten manuscript journal of the Senate from 1834 was brought out of the vaults, and they found the right page, and they crossed out the resolution of censure. The clerk was ordered to draw black lines around it as if it had never existed. Meanwhile, the Bank of the United States, finally healed and defeated, wound down its business, procured a new charter from the state of Pennsylvania, and continued as a state bank after 1836. Within a few years, it got involved in cotton speculations that went bad, and it closed its doors, bankrupt and disgraced. Well, what do we make out of all this? And I know you are thinking, what's the point? Okay, here's the point. Some historians, and especially economists, take a kind of instrumentalist approach to history, and they fault Jackson severely for his actions in the bank war. They defend the Bank of the United States as a modern-style central bank, ahead of its time. They charge that Jackson had no decent replacement for it. And they blame his use of state banks, which is where Jackson put the money after it was taken out of the Bank of the United States, blamed that for triggering an inflationary boom that ended with a crash, the so-called Panic of 1837, that in turn ushered in a deep depression that lasted through the end of the 1830s and into the 1840s. All of this, they said, because of Jackson's war on the bank. Now, all of these propositions can be and have been disputed. The bank was not constructed like a modern central bank. It's not clear that Biddle was operating it as such or would have understood what a modern central bank does. The question of blame for the panic is basically irresolvable because the answer lies at the end of a long chain of hypotheticals. What would have happened if Jackson had not removed the deposits? Or what would have happened if the Bank of England had not raised interest rates at a particular time? Or what would have happened if the Chinese had not found a new way to finance their opium imports? And no, I'm not making that up. That's part of the argument. In fact, it's a major part of the argument. And you can go on down the list of what caused the Panic of 1837. Really, we just don't know. Now, it is true that Jackson had no ready substitute for the bank. Using state banks as depositories was what was frankly dubbed an experiment. And it would be fruitless to try to claim for Jackson a sophisticated grasp of banking and finance. A historian named Bray Hammond famously said once of one of Jackson's ideas for replacing the Bank of the United States that, and these are Hammond's words, that it may be intelligible, to those whose understanding has not been corrupted by some knowledge and experience of the subject. In other words, if you know anything about banking, you know that Jackson doesn't. But a primitive understanding is not necessarily a false one. Bankers then, and dare I say today, shrouded their operations in a kind of forbidding mystery. Let a president or a congressional committee inquire into them, and the answer may be, and this was certainly Biddle's answer, a politely phrased version of, never you mind. We understand these matters. You don't. Go away. Leave us alone. But there can also be moments, and I think we can all remember one a few years later, when the banker's facade of omniscience collapses and that dismissive, trust us, we know what we're doing, gives way to a kind of embarrassed, oops. It's debatable, in short, whether the person who knows he doesn't fully understand a subject is worse off than the person who thinks he does. And yet all this perhaps misses the point. Jackson was not mainly concerned about the bank's efficacy as a financial agent, though we question that as well. His core concern was political. He thought the intertwining of government operations with banking and corporate finance was inherently dangerous, politically corrupting, a threat to democracy itself. He worried about the presence within a republic of a financial institution that was so huge and with its powers so fortified by special privilege that it could, even in defiance of the people's own will, run the country to suit itself. Was Jackson wrong to worry about that? Well, the actual conduct of the Bank of the United States offers no reason to think that he was. We can blame Biddle for descending into politics, and some have. But the fact was that the bank's very nature as a congressionally chartered, profit-making corporation wielding monopoly official powers was inescapably political. As Biddle himself remarked, when it came to loaning money to congressmen or newspapers, he was damned if he did and damned if he didn't. It would look political either way. The bank, for instance, made large loans to the Washington printing house of Gales and Seton, who were publishers of the country's leading anti-Jackson newspaper, the Washington National Intelligencer. Biddle justified these loans as solid business transactions. They were made on good security. But part of that security was the anticipated profit from government printing contracts, which were awarded by Congress on a party vote. So what message or lesson does the bank war leave for us today? I do not think, as economists sometimes do, that it can furnish some kind of policy pointers of any practical use. Contrary to that famous aphorism, history does not repeat itself, at least not in any precise or predictable way. Our circumstances now may resemble those of Jackson's day in some ways, but not in others. And the differences matter at least as much as the similarities. The Bank of the United States was indeed, as the New York Times said last year, a predecessor of the Federal Reserve. If you can imagine, the Federal Reserve is a privately controlled, profit-making, dividend-paying shop run by the boys from Enron. The lesson, I think, if there is one, is broader and less specific, not so much a prescription as a caution. Speaking of governmental checks and balances, way back at the time of the adoption of the Constitution, James Madison, in Federalist Paper number 51, famously said, these are Madison's words, "It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices, checks and balances in government, should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary." Well, in 1829, in the very first skirmish between the Bank of the United States and the Jackson administration, Biddle had repelled those accusations of political favoritism on the part of the bank in the 1820 2008 campaign by telling Jackson's Treasury Secretary, at that time a guy named Ingham, that the 500 men who ran the bank and its branches were so disinterested that no loan had ever been made or refused, in his words, on account of political partiality or hostility. Ingham, replying to this, challenged what he called Biddle's assertion of universal purity. And Ingham remarked that no human institution, and these are Ingham words, could claim an entire exemption from the influence of feelings and passions inseparable from human nature. Jackson, reading this exchange, wrote in the margin opposite that, "Well said," and he underlined it. And indeed, James Madison and Andrew Jackson were saying the same thing. Banks are but human institutions. And while they, like other such institutions, including government, can to a degree be controlled and circumscribed by rules and procedures or by checks and balances, ultimately they cannot be made more infallible than the people who run them. The ultimate question posed by the bank was thus the same as that posed by government itself. How could a system of finance and credit be created which was sufficiently stable and uniform to perform its necessary tasks properly, without becoming so powerful, without that it would use its powers improperly and corruptly and ultimately become a threat to the very citizens whom it was supposed to serve? That riddle confronted Andrew Jackson and the bank in the Bank of the United in the bank war. It still confronts us today, and that means that the banks plural, the banks, as well as the government, still bear watching. Thank you. Do you want to do questions?
Yeah, do questions. No, this was wonderful. We have a few minutes for questions before you all go as well, and then we do have a reception. But there is a handheld microphone, which is back here with Dr. Costello, with Matt Costello, our senior historian. So any questions? Don't leave us up here alone. Somebody. There we go. I have Taker.
Thanks. I have two questions. The first is simply, what biography of Andrew Jackson would you recommend for people looking for an accurate scholarly study? Second, in Holmes Alexander's biography of Martin Van Buren, he had suggested that Van Buren went along with Jackson's bank policy but didn't really believe in it. Do you believe that that was correct?
Let me answer the second one first because it's easier. No. And who was the author? Yeah, get another biography. Would it help answer that to tell you that when Jackson was collecting ideas for the bank veto, Van Buren was a willing contributor. Van Buren was in fact not only not a supporter of the bank veto, but he had been pushing it on Jackson from the beginning. And Van Buren did write this posthumously published autobiography where he just talks about how the bank veto was wonderful. And Van Buren then as president, when, Andrew Jackson was still kind of looking over his shoulder from Tennessee, but when Van Buren was president himself, he took the policy to the next level. Since the state banks were an interim experiment, the next thing to do is, in the phrase of the time, divorce bank and state. Separate out the federal government's financial arrangements so that they have nothing to do with banks whatsoever. And set up something instead called the independent treasury. The independent treasury was the leading policy of the Van Buren administration. So he was 100% behind it. Good biography. Well, the best biography that I can recommend to you was published in 1860, and it's rather long. It's in 3 volumes. An early historian named James Parton did a 3-volume life of Andrew Jackson. And I still think it's the best, by the way, it's very critical of Jackson. I still think it's the best biography. This is the biography, if you've ever seen the famous phrase about Jackson's ignorance was a wall around him, a high impenetrable wall, and that he paced back and forth within the cage of his ignorance like a chained panther. That comes from that biography. John Meacham's recent Pulitzer Prize-winning biography is a good read. I think it's better on kind of social atmosphere of the White House than it is on policy. It's not really a wonks biography. Robert Remini, R-E-M-I-N-I, who's just died a few years ago, he spent a career writing biographies of Jackson. And frankly, they got sloppier as he went on. And so I think the first one, which is still out, which was written in the 1950s and then later updated to include things that he had left out of it, like slavery and Indian removal. That one's still a good read, and in the updated version's very good.
Other questions? Yep, there you go. Okay.
It's two-part.
Wait for the mic. Yeah, see Matt can get over there.
It's two-part, but I don't know if it's really related. Well, it is related. Was there any commodity back in the currency back at that time? And the other question was, what was the inflationary climate that the bank was being opened on? Because I know it was a precursor to the Federal Reserve, so it wasn't interest rates as we know them today, but
well, it was a, quote, precursor of the Federal Reserve. Inflation was not an accepted part of the economic system at the time. So there was inflation and there was at times deflation. But when prices and values changed, the assumption was that something had gone wrong. Now, over a long period of time, you can chart in inflation, an inflationary trend. But generally in the 19th century, when there was measurable inflation, things are more expensive this year than they were last year, it was when there was some disruptive event. Like during the Civil War, there's plenty of inflation. But the assumption of economists at the time was that prices, wages, values ought to be stable. Now, the first part of the question, yeah, it was a specie-backed currency. And I didn't want to get into banknotes because it takes a whole hour to explain banknotes and if you thought what I did say was less than exciting, you should hear that part of it. Supposedly the only real money was gold and silver, specie, and all everything else was a representation. So what banks did when they got charters was that they allegedly had a certain amount of gold of specie in their vaults. They would issue notes which functioned as money, but they're really IOUs from the cashier of the bank, saying this thing is worth $10. If you want, you can bring it in, and I'll give you 10 real dollars for it, a gold dollar. And what the banks, of course, hoped then as now is that not too many of people bring them in at the same time because there was no deposit insurance. And if you get a run on the bank folds. What often happened, and this is what I was talking about, is there were some banks that were created where the specie that allegedly was backing the paper money didn't exist. Today, I think a modern economist would say, well, it doesn't really matter. What underlies the soundness of our currency today is everybody's faith in it. Why is a $20 bill worth $20 today? It's worth $20 because the government tells you so. And as long as we all accept that, it's worth $20 anywhere you go. It doesn't matter whether there's a hypothetical gold piece behind it or not. That is a 20th century understanding of economics.
One more question. Please go ahead.
Thanks. Thanks for your presentation. It's wonderful. But I wonder, at that time when they have election of president and maybe some officials, in the environment, do they put this as a issues for the bank to control our government? Is it a real issue in the election, or it's just all covered up and silenced down? People don't know about it.
No, it was a real issue. I could answer this in several different ways. Was it a decisive issue? Nobody can ever tell. You know, the only thing you can tell at the end of a presidential election is that one person won. Jackson himself believed that since he had, remember the timing here, recharter bill passed Congress in early July of 1832. Jackson vetoed it. Then the election was in November. Jackson himself took that overwhelming re-election, because it was overwhelming, he stomped Henry Clay pretty badly, as a mandate, in a modern word. And indeed, Jackson's, as he said over and over again, the people have spoken. This issue was before them. If they didn't want me to kill the bank and proceed further against it, they would have voted me out of office, and therefore I have been empowered to proceed further in killing the bank. If you read the newspapers of the time, if you read the pamphlet literature of the time, the bank issue is all over it. You know, it's bank, 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 bank. Were people also voting on other grounds? Sure.
I want to add a thought as well. This is a sort of White House Historical Association comment. But, you know, as I said earlier in introducing Dr. Feller, you know, one of our, in fact, overarching goal is to bring scholars, to bring professors, experts in the field, family members of presidents to the association to enlighten the public. And what we've seen here tonight, and really thank you so much, Dan, is to breathe life into a moment in the 1820s and the 1830s that happened right over there and sort of right around the square here. Decatur House was here as well. There were people looking out the window, talking in these rooms right over here while all of this was happening. And so please really join me in thanking Professor Feller, really, you know, for making this happen.
You're watching America.